Imagine this. The sun isn't up yet, but you're already sharpening an axe. Not for wood, but for a man the town will gather to watch you execute. Before most people even open their eyes, your work has already begun. Quiet, heavy, inevitable. Tonight, we're stepping into the lives of the people who held the most terrifying jobs in history. The ones who worked in shadows, blood, darkness, and danger. From executioners to tomb crawlers to plague workers, to the men who vanished into mines so deadly they were called living graves. These weren't heroes or villains, just ordinary people doing extraordinary, horrifying work because someone had to. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy these long, quiet journeys into the stranger side of history. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It never stops being surreal. People all over the world, in the dark, sharing these forgotten stories together. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let's start this journey with the people whose mornings began with an axe and a name on a list. Deep beneath the burning sun of ancient Egypt, far from the shimmering Nile and the busy markets, there was a world that almost no one ever saw. A world carved into stone, one chisel mark at a time. The tomb builders of Egypt lived between two extremes, the scorching desert above and the pitch-black silence below. Every morning, they walked toward the Valley of the Kings, past cliffs that had stood for thousands of years, knowing that each day might be their last, long before their tombs would ever be built. They weren't slaves. They were skilled workers, stonecutters, draftsmen, sculptors, painters. But the environment they lived in was brutally unforgiving. To build a pharaoh's eternal resting place meant descending into narrow shafts, crawling through corridors filled with dust fine enough to coat your tongue, and chipping away at rock that had trapped heat since the dawn of the world. Inside the tombs, oxygen was scarce. Torches flickered and smoked, leaving trails of soot that clung to the walls and filled the air with something thick and scratchy. The deeper you went, the warmer it became. Some chambers were so hot that workers collapsed with the heat stroke. And then, there was the constant fear of collapse. All it took was one wrong strike. One weak ceiling beam. One loud crack that echoed in the dark. The deeper levels of the tombs were dug into limestone, but pockets of weak stone existed everywhere. Some workers described hearing faint trickling sounds, only to realize it was sand pouring through small cracks above their heads. They dug anyway. Hours passed in silence except for the slow tap of chisels and the steady breath of men pressed shoulder to shoulder in tunnels barely wide enough for one person. There was no room for panic. If you got stuck, you stayed stuck. The only light came from tiny oil lamps that smoked and sputtered with every exhale. When the workday ended, they climbed back out into the blinding sun, the world feeling unreal after hours of darkness. They returned to their small village, Deir el Medina, a community built entirely for these workers and their families. Here, people lived ordinary lives, cooking, arguing, playing games, raising children. Yet at any moment, a husband or brother might not come back from the tomb. The irony, of course, was that they built magnificent resting places for kings, yet many of them were buried in much simpler graves. Some of their names are still written on the tomb walls, tiny, nearly invisible graffiti, a quiet rebellion, a small hope that if the pharaoh would be remembered forever, maybe they would be too. For most of history, no one told their story. Tonight, you just heard it whispered back into the light. Now leave the desert behind and step into a place that could not be more different, yet just as deadly. A place where the ground shook, the crowd roared, and the air smelled of sweat, dust, and blood. Welcome to the arenas of ancient Rome. When people picture gladiators, they imagine men fighting for glory beneath a blazing sun. But behind every gladiator was someone whose job was even more dangerous. The gladiator trainers and the beast keepers. They lived in the shadow of violence every day. Gladiator trainers, called doctores, worked in specialized schools. To train fighters meant sparring with men who were already strong, desperate, and constantly on edge. Accidents were common. A wrong block, a mistimed strike, a trainee who got nervous. One slip, and the trainer could be the one bleeding on the sand. Weapons were often dulled, but not always. Injuries were expected. Broken arms, torn skin, bruised ribs. A good trainer learned to move like a dancer, anticipating attacks before they began. But as dangerous as training real fighters was, nothing compared to working with the animals. Rome loved exotic creatures. Lions, tigers, bears, panthers, crocodiles. Even elephants were dragged from far corners of the empire into dark underground cages beneath the arenas. Beast keepers, bestiarii, had to feed them, transport them, calm them, sometimes even bathe them. None of this was safe. Imagine entering a cage with a half-starved lion whose last meal came 3 days ago. You hold a wooden pole, your only protection, while pushing in a bucket of meat. You hope it eats the food and not your arm. The floors were slick with urine and old blood. The animals paced constantly, restless and angry. Many were sick, injured, or terrified. A beastkeeper had to get close enough to secure chains, inspect claws, or clean wounds, all while knowing the animal could snap without warning. And then there was the worst moment, release. Before games began, beastkeepers guided the animals into ramps and lifts that raised them into the arena. In the darkness below, you heard the crowd chanting above your head. The lion snarled at the noise. The wooden gates trembled. The air smelled like dust and fear. The moment the gate burst open, the animal exploded forward. If the timing was wrong, even by a second, the beastkeeper could be caught in the path and torn apart before anyone noticed. Some beastkeepers didn't survive a single season. But the most chilling part, many of the animals remembered faces. And if a keeper mistreated one, the next feeding was personal. These men trained killers, fed predators, and risked their lives for the entertainment of tens of thousands of Romans, who watched from safe seats, eating bread and cheering. Tonight, you're hearing the story from the shadows, where the real danger lived. For our last journey in this section, follow me far below the earth, into a place even the bravest men feared. The Laurian silver mines of ancient Greece helped build Athens. The ships, the weapons, even the great monuments. Many were funded by silver pulled from deep underground by slaves, prisoners, and children. These mines were not simply dark, they were suffocating. Imagine squeezing through a slit carved into stone, barely wider than your shoulders and crawling downward on your stomach. Your elbows scrape rock, your knees press into jagged gravel. The air becomes warm, heavy, stale. Your torch burns weakly, fighting for oxygen. And this is just the entrance. Inside the mines, tunnels twisted like a maze. Some chambers were so low you couldn't raise your head. Others were so narrow that if you inhaled too deeply, your chest would brush the walls. The dust was the real killer. Silver and lead particles floated invisibly in the air, entering the lungs and settling there forever. Miners coughed blood, choked, and died young. Many worked naked or nearly naked, not by choice, but because clothes caught on the rock. Every movement risked tearing skin. Heat built up the deeper you went. Some tunnels were so hot that sweat evaporated instantly. There were no water breaks, no fresh air, no sunrise or sunset, only darkness and the slow, relentless tapping of iron tools echoing through the stone. Children were often sent into the smallest spaces. Their job was to crawl ahead, carrying tiny lamps, collecting ore, or clearing debris with their hands. Many didn't come back out. If a tunnel collapsed, no rescue was possible. The rock simply swallowed them. Above ground, overseers waited with whips, ready to punish anyone who slowed down, and every day a new group descended into the mines, knowing exactly what awaited them. Lead poisoning was common. Some miners went blind. Others developed tremors that never stopped. Many died without ever seeing the sunlight again. And yet, from these terrible conditions came the wealth of an entire civilization. The mines fueled Athens' navy. They shaped politics, trade, and war. They funded temples that still stand today, marble glowing in the sun, built on the backs of men who never saw the sky again. Tonight, we remember the miners not as numbers or statistics, but as people whose lives were spent in darkness so others could live in the light. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the wind carries the scent of pine and cold stone, there lies a sanctuary that the ancient world considered the closest thing to the voice of the gods. Delphi. Pilgrims traveled for weeks, sometimes months, across mountains and rocky coastlines just to hear a few cryptic words from the oracle, the Pythia. But behind that sacred mystery were workers whose lives were far less glamorous than the myths suggested. The oracle attendants. Their job was simple in description, but terrifying in practice. They were responsible for guiding the Pythia into her trance, maintaining the sacred chamber, controlling the crowds, preparing rituals, and, most dangerous of all, working inside the fume-filled Aditon, the inner room where the oracle spoke. Imagine the morning rituals. Before sunrise, attendants climbed the steep stone path leading to the temple. Cold wind whipped through the columns as they opened the heavy wooden doors. The inside was dark, silent, and frigid. They lit oil lamps one by one, shadows dancing across carved walls, bronze cauldrons, and offerings left by long-forgotten visitors. Their first duty was to inspect the sacred space beneath the temple, a cramped chamber where the Pythia would sit on a tripod above a fissure in the rock. Legends said vapors rose from the earth, sent by Apollo himself. But to the attendants, these vapors were simply dangerous. They caused dizziness, confusion, hallucinations, headaches, sudden sleep, even vomiting. Attendants breathed them constantly, day after day, year after year. Some described the smell as sweet, others as sharp and metallic. Some felt a warmth in their chest when they inhaled it. Others collapsed. But the world believed the gods spoke through those fumes, so the attendants kept working. When a pilgrim arrived, attendants controlled everything. They dressed the Pythia, bathed her feet, combed her hair, tied her robe with sacred knots. They guided her down the narrow stone stairs, each step echoing in the dim hallway, to the inner chamber. The oracle often trembled before entering, but attendants supported her silently, as if preparing a fragile vessel for the divine. Once she sat on the tripod, the fumes began to rise. Her breathing deepened, her eyes unfocused. Her voice quivered, then broke into murmurs, cries, or fragmented whispers. The world above heard prophecy, but the attendants heard something more raw, something frightening. The oracle sometimes screamed, sometimes laughed, sometimes wept, sometimes clawed at the air as if swatting away invisible shapes. The attendants stayed by her side, steadying her shoulders, catching her when she swayed, wiping sweat from her face. They inhaled everything she inhaled, and they were the ones who interpreted her words. Yes, the oracle spoke, but attendants turned sounds into sentences, fragments into meaning. They shaped the prophecies that kings used to wage wars, that families used to decide marriages, that generals used to decide whether to attack or retreat. A single misinterpreted syllable could change history. And yet, after the oracle finished, the attendants led her back up the stairs, settled her into a cool room, cleaned the sacred tripod, and prepared for the next supplicant, sometimes dozens in a single day. The temple's exterior was magnificent, columns glowing in the sun, pilgrims singing hymns, priests chanting. But behind the scenes, attendants breathed toxic air, performed repetitive rituals, and held the physical and mental weight of the oracle's visions. Some didn't last a year. Others grew strange, quiet, tense, twitchy. Some developed chronic tremors. Some fainted often. Some simply disappeared from records. And yet, every civilization that visited Delphi, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, depended on their work. Not just the oracle's words, but the people who made those words understandable. Tonight, the attendants step out from the shadows of 1,000 years, carrying the scent of incense and strange vapors with them. Now we travel far across oceans and centuries, to a world alive with color, music, and the heartbeat of ritual, a world where the sun itself needed help to rise. The Aztec Empire, known for its towering temples, its vibrant markets, and its complex social structure. But behind all of that stood a religion powered by blood, ceremony, and a belief that the gods demanded nourishment. And carrying out those rituals were not just priests, but their assistants. Young men often chosen for their discipline, devotion, or physical endurance, who performed some of the most terrifying, exhausting, and emotionally overwhelming tasks in the empire. Their day began long before dawn. The city around them was still asleep, canoes drifting silently on the water, torches flickering on the causeways, the air cool and still. But the assistants climbed the steep steps of the temple, carrying buckets of water, baskets of herbs, incense sticks, obsidian blades, wooden masks, paint jars, feathers, and cloth stained from the previous day's rituals. At the top of the temple, the air was thin, the stone floor cold, the horizon purple with the first hint of sunrise. Their first task, clean the altar. And this was not simple sweeping. They scrubbed dried blood from stone. They washed ritual knives. They wiped the platform where offerings had been made. Sometimes, the stains were so deep that they remained permanently dark, no matter how hard they scrubbed. As the priest chanted inside, the assistants prepared the sacred tools. Obsidian shards sharp enough to cut instantly, incense bowls filled with copal that released thick white smoke when burned, ceremonial masks painted with bright reds, blues, and blacks. Then came the participants, sometimes volunteers, sometimes warriors captured in battle, sometimes nobles offering sacrifices to secure harvests, victory, or health. The assistants guided them, washed them, painted their faces, tied their wrists, whispered prayers, comforted them, or, in darker moments, held them still. Their job was not to question. Their job was to perform the rituals flawlessly. During major ceremonies, thousands gathered below the temple steps. Drums thundered, conch shells blared, dancers moved in circles, the air filled with smoke so thick it stung the eyes. The priests entered their trance, chanting and moving with slow, deliberate motions, and the assistants stood in inches away. They held the instruments, they carried the offerings, they steadied trembling hands. They prepared hearts and bodies for rituals few modern people can imagine. The emotional weight was enormous. Some assistants described moments in which the drums faded into the background, the crowd became silent, and all they could hear was their own shaky breathing. Yet they continued, because they believed life depended on their work. If the sun was to rise, if crops were to grow, if the world was to continue, the rituals had to be done. After the ceremonies, the assistants carried the remains with solemnity. They washed the altar again. They wrapped sacred objects in cloth. They gathered spilled offerings, feathers, and incense ash. Their hands shook. Their clothes were soaked. Their faces streaked with sweat and paint. And then, after hours of ritual and exhaustion, they walked back down the steps, past cheering crowds, through the marketplace, across the canals, and into the priestly quarters. There, in quiet rooms, they washed their hands and arms again and again, as if the water could erase what they had witnessed. But the hardest part, tomorrow they would do it again. Yet these assistants were not morbid figures. Many were scholars, poets, musicians, astronomers. They studied calendars, stars, plants, and mathematics. They lived in a world where science and religion intertwined, where rituals aligned with astronomical cycles, where blood was not cruelty but necessity. To them, they were not performing horror, but maintaining balance. Centuries later, their work is often misunderstood, reduced to brutality without context. But standing in their sandals, feeling the warmth of sunrise on the temple steps, hearing the distant sound of dancers and drums, you understand a deeper truth. They believed they were keeping the universe alive. Tonight, their story rises again from the stone temples and the swirling incense of a world that shaped Mexico long before modern borders existed. Imagine this. The streets are quiet, the town asleep, but someone has to descend into the darkness below, into tunnels filled with a smell so thick it seems to cling to your lungs. Gong farmers, as they were called, were the medieval equivalent of sanitation workers, but the reality of their job was far more terrifying and grueling than anything modern sewage work. They dug through human waste night after night to clean the cesspits of cities like London. Rich or poor, noble or commoner, everyone produced excrement. Someone had to remove it. And that someone was a gong farmer. Their work began at night because the stench was unbearable during the day. Armed with long shovels, buckets, and basic tools, they descended through narrow wooden hatches into underground pits. The darkness was total. Their only illumination came from tiny lanterns, which cast flickering, unstable light over the sludge. The air was thick with ammonia, methane, and other gases that could knock a man unconscious in seconds. Breathing too deeply meant choking, dizziness, or worse. Methane pockets could explode without warning. One careless spark from a lantern, one wrong movement, and the tunnel could erupt into fire. Yet the work never stopped. Overflowing privies, leaking cesspits, and stagnant water demanded constant attention. Every shift, gong farmers dug, shoveled, and transported waste through cramped, foul-smelling corridors. They carried their loads to carts waiting above ground, often spilling some along the way, staining their own skin and clothing. Accidents were common. People slipped into the sludge. Tools broke. Wooden planks gave way, plunging men into freezing, waste-filled water. Some didn't survive, and yet there was a strange rhythm to their work. Every night they descended into darkness. Every night they emerged filthy, exhausted, alive. It was dirty, it was dangerous, and it was essential. The irony? The higher the social status, the cleaner their streets. But the cost was the same. A gong farmer sweating and gagging in the shadows below. Their names rarely appear in records, and yet medieval towns relied entirely on their grim labor. Tonight, the echoes of their shovels resonate once more, in the quiet spaces beneath history's bustling streets. During the outbreaks of the Black Death, plague doctors were among the few who ventured into streets filled with death and disease. Their long robes and bird-shaped masks stuffed with herbs were designed to protect them, but often offered only a thin layer of safety. The plague was invisible, lethal, and indiscriminate. Doctors carried wooden canes used to examine patients from a distance or to direct attendance. They monitored symptoms, treated the sick with crude remedies, and recorded observations. In reality, many of the treatments were ineffective, but the doctor's presence offered comfort, even if brief, to terrified communities. The daily life of a plague doctor was a constant confrontation with death. Cities were littered with corpses, rats scurried through alleys, and families were quarantined with infected members. Doctors navigated this grim landscape, sometimes succumbing to the very disease they treated. The psychological toll was immense. Witnessing mass suffering, hearing the cries of the dying, and managing fear while attempting treatment shaped the doctor's world. Many kept detailed journals of symptoms and observations, creating some of the earliest medical records. Yet survival was uncertain. Few made it through multiple outbreaks, and those who did carried the weight of the horror they had witnessed. Despite the danger, plague doctors were essential. Kings, merchants, and ordinary citizens relied on their expertise. They moved through fear and filth, offering treatment and comfort where they could, even knowing each patient could be their last. Stonemasons were responsible for constructing Europe's great cathedrals, castles, and bridges. Their work required incredible skill, strength, and above all, courage. Every day they faced life-threatening conditions. Masons balanced on the scaffolds hundreds of feet above the ground, moving massive stones with ropes, pulleys, and cranes. One misstep could mean a fatal fall. Tools were rudimentary, and shaping hard stone required repeated, precise strikes. The sound of hammers echoed endlessly, marking the rhythm of their labor. The height was only one danger. Dust from carving irritated lungs, and prolonged exposure often caused respiratory damage. Weather added another layer of risk. Wind, rain, and scorching sun made each day unpredictable. Despite these dangers, masons worked with focus and precision, knowing that a single error could endanger not only their own life, but also the lives of co-workers below. Accidents were common. Stones fell, scaffolds collapsed, ropes snapped. The masons' hands were calloused, their muscles strained, and yet their work was meticulous. Each arch, each buttress, each carving contributed to buildings that would stand for centuries. These structures were monuments to both skill and bravery. Even after centuries, the legacy of medieval stonemasons remains. Every soaring cathedral and fortified castle tells the story of men who risked everything for creation. The beauty of these structures is inseparable from the danger endured to build them. The executioner was one of the most feared and most necessary figures in medieval society. Cities depended on him to enforce justice, maintain order, and deliver punishment. Yet to everyone else, he existed on the edge of humanity. Part servant of the law, part outcast, part symbol of death walking among the living. Executioners lived separate from the public. People avoided them in markets, children were taught not to look at them, and families often carried the weight of the role across generations. It wasn't uncommon for the son of an executioner to inherit the job, not out of desire, but because no one else would hire him for anything else. Every morning had its own ritual: the sharpening of the axe, the checking of the rope, the inspection of the scaffold. Tools mattered. A dull blade could turn one clean stroke into several gruesome ones. A poor rope could snap, forcing a second attempt. The public judged not only the condemned, but also the executioner's skill. Too quick, and they would whisper he was cruel. Too slow, and they would call him incompetent. Executions were usually public events. The entire town gathered to watch, not just for justice, but for spectacle. Punishment was entertainment in an age without modern distractions. Vendors sold food, children climbed walls, and merchants closed their shops. The executioner stood at the center of it all, calm, silent, focused. Before the execution, he often met the condemned. Sometimes he offered a drink, sometimes a prayer, sometimes nothing. The conversations were rarely recorded, but the moment lingered heavy between two people whose lives were about to become permanently linked. Beheading required precision. One strike was ideal, 2 was unfortunate, 3 was humiliating for everyone. Observers judged, and the executioner's reputation could rise or fall based on the swing of an arm. Hanging was another common method. Simple rope, tied carefully and measured by height and weight. Too short a drop, and the condemned choked slowly. Too long, and the neck snapped violently. The executioner had to calculate, adjust, and consider the body before him, ensuring the punishment matched the expectations of authority. Burnings, drownings, and wheel executions were rarer, but when they happened, the executioner was always the one to prepare them. Each method had its own ritual, its own timing, its own moral weight. When the crowd left, the executioner's work wasn't done. Bodies needed to be disposed of, the scaffold cleaned, tools wiped down. Everything had to be ready for the next job, because there was always a next job. Outside of executions, the executioner often doubled as a torturer. Medieval justice relied heavily on confessions, whether voluntary or coerced. The executioner operated the rack, tightened the thumbscrews or heated irons for branding. These tasks were sanctioned by the courts, documented, and carried out with an unsettling mixture of professionalism and detachment. But for all the brutality, executioners were not monsters. Many had families. Many lived quiet, isolated lives. They planted gardens, raised children, and prayed in churches, though always at the back, separated from the others. Their hands, stained by duty, were both needed and avoided. Some communities granted them privileges: free lodging, exemptions from taxes, special permission to operate taverns or brothels, because few others wanted the jobs. They lived on the margins, both protected and shunned. In death, many executioners remained unnamed. Records describe their role, but not their lives. Yet every city, every village, every kingdom had someone who carried out the darkest orders of the law. Someone who stood between chaos and order, justice and cruelty, life and death. And tonight, we walk silently beside them, listening to the weight of each step they took toward the scaffold. Torturers and inquisitors occupied a unique, disturbing place in medieval justice. They were not executioners, though their work often led to death. Their role was to extract truth, or what officials believed to be truth, through methods designed to break both body and spirit. The room where they worked was dim, cold, and usually hidden beneath a castle or courthouse. Thick doors muffled screams. Torches flickered on stone walls. The tools were arranged neatly, as if prepared for a craftsman. Ropes, pulleys, iron bars, chains, wedges, boots, and the infamous rack. Torture was rarely random. It followed legal procedures, written and approved by courts and clergy. Confessions were considered the highest form of proof, and many believed truth could only be found under extreme pressure. Inquisitors, often educated men, asked the questions. Torturers carried out the physical work. The rack was one of the most feared devices. The victim lay on a long wooden frame, wrists tied at one end, ankles at the other. Turning a wheel tightened the ropes, pulling the body until joints strained, popped, and finally dislocated. The silence before the first turn was often the worst moment, anticipation overwhelming the senses. Other methods were less dramatic, but equally painful. The strappado hoisted a person by their wrist tied behind their back, forcing shoulders to wrench forward. Thumb screws crushed bone slowly. Iron boots compressed the legs. Water torture forced liquid into the lungs and stomach, creating panic as breathing became impossible. But the room was not just filled with physical suffering. The psychological pressure was immense. Darkness, isolation, repeated questioning. The presence of instruments carefully displayed where prisoners could see them. Every detail was designed to weaken resistance. Yet torturers themselves were often more complex than caricatures of cruelty. Many saw themselves as servants of the law, not sadists, but instruments. Their work was controlled, measured, and documented. They were trained not to kill, but to extract information without ending a life prematurely. Some torturers lived private, quiet lives outside their chambers. They were fathers, neighbors, and citizens. But their work isolated them socially. People whispered behind their backs. Some avoided eye contact. Others believed the torturer absorbed the sins of those he handled. Inquisitors, meanwhile, believed they served moral duty. Their task was to protect society from heresy, treason, witchcraft, or sedition. Their questions shaped the path of interrogation. They interpreted answers. They judged guilt. Their decisions determined how far the torturer was allowed to go. Trials could last days or months. Some prisoners confessed quickly. Others resisted, holding on to their innocence or guilt. Every crack of rope, every tightening of screws, every breathless gasp was recorded, as if pain itself was a language. In rare cases, the accused was released after torture, sometimes crippled for life, sometimes mentally broken. But more often, torture was simply one step toward execution. The confessions sealed their fate. The torturer cleaned the instruments, wiped the blood, and extinguished the torches. Another day ended. Another case closed. Yet the echoes of what happened lingered in the chambers long after everyone left. For all the darkness attached to the role, torturers were also survivors of their own emotional burden. Some drank heavily, others isolated themselves. A few wrote journals describing the toll of their work, confessions of guilt buried in ink. But most stayed silent, carrying the weight privately. Their world was structured by laws we now see as cruel, unfair, or shocking. But in their time, torture was not only accepted, it was expected. It shaped justice, religion, politics, and fear. It was a tool of power used by those who believed deeply in their authority. And so, the torturer and the inquisitor stood together in a dim room beneath the courts, turning screams into confessions and confessions into sentences. Their faces rarely remembered, their roles rarely spoken of outside official records. Tonight, we descend those stone stairs again, into a chamber where justice and cruelty were indistinguishable, and where truth was measured not by honesty, but by endurance. Long before engines, radios, or modern navigation, sailors boarded wooden ships and pushed into oceans most people had never seen. These voyages were brutal. They stretched for months, sometimes years, with no guarantee of returning home. The age of discovery opened the world, but it also exposed sailors to some of the most terrifying conditions any profession has ever faced. Life on board began with cramped quarters. Hammocks swayed above barrels of dried food, tools, and gunpowder. Privacy didn't exist. The smell of tar, sweat, damp rope, and stale air settled into everything. Days blurred into routines of hauling ropes, repairing sails, cleaning the deck, and managing cargo. Even sleep was unstable. Only a few hours at a time, often interrupted by the watch bell. Food was a constant source of misery. Fresh supplies spoiled within weeks. What remained was hardtack. Rock-hard biscuits, often infested with weevils. Salted meat turned slimy in heat. Water grew algae. The taste became something sailors simply endured. Hunger was an ever-present companion, and starvation wasn't uncommon on longer voyages. Scurvy was the sailors' worst enemy. Without fresh fruits or vegetables, their bodies slowly deteriorated. Gums bled, teeth loosened and fell out, legs swelled. Old wounds reopened. The disease turned strong sailors into fragile, trembling shells of themselves. Some ships lost half their crew before sighting land again. And then there were storms, vast, unstoppable mountains of wind and water. When the clouds darkened and the waves rose, every man rushed to his station. The ship groaned as though alive. Waves crashed over the deck with the force of falling trees. Lightning split the sky, illuminating terrified faces for only a moment. Storms tested everything: rope, wood, leadership, courage. Sailors were swept overboard, their cries lost instantly in the roar of the sea. Masts snapped, sails tore, and the ship became a fragile shell fighting against nature. In those moments, every man understood how small he truly was. Rats were the ship's permanent passengers. They scurried through barrels, chewed holes in supplies, and carried disease. Some sailors hunted them for sport. Others hunted them for food when rations ran dangerously low. But perhaps the most unpredictable danger wasn't the sea. It was the discipline. Life aboard a vessel required absolute order. A single mistake, dropping a lantern, mistying a rope, hesitating during a maneuver, could endanger everyone. Captains enforced strict rules through harsh punishments. Flogging was common. Men were tied to the mast and whipped with knotted cords that tore open skin. Imprisonment, starvation rations, or being chained below deck were other punishments. The worst was keel hauling, dragging a man under the ship's barnacle-covered hull. Few survived without severe injuries. It was meant as a lesson to others, discipline born out of the need for survival. Despite all this, sailors pressed on. They endured fear, hunger, storms, and disease because the sea offered something no land-based life could: a chance at discovery, a chance at adventure, a chance to be part of something larger than themselves. They charted coastlines, crossed oceans, and returned with stories that reshaped the world. But behind every map drawn and every new land claimed was the suffering of countless sailors whose names never appeared in history books. Tonight, we stand on the deck beside them. The lanterns sway. The waves stretch endlessly, and the horizon is as uncertain as the days ahead. Whaling ships of the 17th to 19th centuries carried crews into some of the coldest, harshest, and most unforgiving waters on Earth. Their mission: to hunt massive creatures capable of sinking a small ship with a single strike. Whalers faced danger every day, on deck, in the tiny whaleboats, and even while they slept. The hunt began with a lookout perched high in the crow's nest, scanning for the telltale plume of a whale's breath. Hours passed in silence as the ship creaked through icy winds. Then, a shout. "There she blows!" Chaos followed. Men scrambled into small rowboats, pulling hard against waves to reach the whale before it slipped back into the depths. The harpooner stood at the bow, muscles taut, rope coiled at his feet. The moment the whale surfaced, he hurled the iron bar with all his strength. If the harpoon struck true, the whale thrashed violently, smashing the water with its tail, overturning boats, or dragging them at terrifying speeds. This was known as the Nantucket sleigh ride, a desperate, uncontrolled sprint behind an enraged animal weighing up to 90 tons. The sea around them churned red, the air filled with the sound of the whale's gasps. A single mistake meant death. Boats capsized, men drowned. Whales struck with enough force to break ribs or shatter oars. Once the whale weakened, the crew moved in with lances, sharp, long weapons meant to pierce deep and end the struggle. Even then, danger was everywhere. A dying whale could roll over unexpectedly, crushing a boat beneath its weight. The ocean was unpredictable, cold, and unforgiving. Back on the main ship, the next stage began: cutting and processing. The whale was hauled alongside, and men climbed onto its back, knives in hand slicing through layers of blubber as waves lifted and lowered the massive body. Slippery decks, swinging hooks, and heavy flensing knives turned this process into a dangerous balancing act. One slip of the blade or misstep on the oily surface could send a man sliding into the sea, or into the path of the next descending knife. The harvested blubber was boiled in large iron pots on deck. These try-works burned day and night, filling the ship with thick, choking smoke. Sparks flew constantly. Many whaling vessels burned to the waterline, taking entire crews with them. Fire was a greater threat than storms, especially in freezing regions where water induced shock the moment someone fell in. The cold was relentless. Whalers often worked with numb hands, frostbitten faces, and wind that cut through clothing like knives. Ice formed on ropes, sails, and beards. Fingers stiffened. Tools slipped. But the hunt couldn't stop. Each whale meant profit for the ship's owners and survival for the men on board. Inside the ship, conditions were no better. The air was thick with the stench of burning oil, mixed with sweat, smoke, and the constant smell of raw flesh. Sleeping quarters were cramped and damp. Food spoiled. Rats thrived. Weeks passed without sight of land. Months without fresh food. Years without returning home. Yet the men stayed. They hunted whales across the globe, from the frigid Arctic to the roaring southern seas, because demand for whale oil was immense. It lit homes, fueled industry, and made fortunes for those lucky enough to return with a full cargo. But many never returned. Boats capsized in storms. Ice-crushed ships trapped between frozen sheets. Whales fought back with astonishing force. Some voyages ended with nothing but empty barrels and disappointed investors. Others ended with wreckage scattered across icy waters. Still, the whalers endured. They rowed toward creatures larger than houses. They faced the cold with bare hands. They stood on burning decks to keep the fires under control. Their world was a mixture of courage, desperation, danger, and determination. And because of them, nations built industries, maps expanded, and legends of the sea grew deeper. Tonight, we step onto one of those creaking decks once more. The air is cold. The lantern light flickers, and somewhere beyond the reach of the waves, a whale rises to the surface, beginning another deadly chase. In the cities of 18th and 19th century Europe, London, Dublin, Edinburgh, Paris, there was a common sight in the early morning. Tiny silhouettes, often no older than 6 or 7, walking the streets barefoot. Their faces were darkened with soot. Their clothes were little more than rags, and over their shoulders they carried brushes, scrapers, and a small bag of tools. These were the chimney sweeps, the workers responsible for cleaning the inside of chimneys in an age when coal was the center of daily life. Every home burned coal, sometimes all day, every day, and those chimneys clogged fast, narrowing with thick, sticky soot that could cause fires or choke a family in smoke if left uncleaned. Owners of houses wanted their chimneys small, small to keep smoke flowing fast, small to keep heat contained, and most importantly, small to reduce building costs. And when chimneys became narrow, twisting, and complicated, only one kind of worker could fit inside: children. Their tiny bodies made them the perfect tools for a job no adult could enter. They were expected to climb, almost like insects, straight up the flue, sometimes 30, 40, even 60 feet into the dark shaft. The only light was what leaked from the fireplace opening, far below them, and the only sound was the scraping of their brushes, the coughs as soot filled their lungs, and the distant voice of the master sweep below, shouting threats if they slowed down. The work began before sunrise. A child sweep was woken up, often by a kick or a shake, fed a crust of bread or nothing at all, and sent straight to the first home of the day. Chimneys were still cold from the night, but not always. Sometimes a homeowner failed to fully extinguish the fire, and a child would climb anyway, because if they refused, their master might beat them, starve them, or worse, abandon them entirely. Inside the chimney, there was nowhere to go except up. A child would press their back against one wall, their legs against the other, and slowly inch upward in a movement called chimneying. Every breath stirred soot. Every movement caused flakes to fall into their eyes and throat. Many children emerged coughing violently, black mucus, bloody noses, all considered normal. And if a child got stuck, which happened often, they were told to work it out, push harder, wriggle, or risk suffocating where they hung. There are stories, dozens of them, of children dying inside chimneys, their lungs filling with soot, or their bodies wedged so tightly they simply could not be retrieved in time. Sometimes their bodies remained inside a chimney for days before anyone realized what the smell was. The dangers continued outside the chimneys too. Constant exposure to soot caused a disease that became so universal among sweeps that doctors named it after them: chimney sweeps cancer. It was the first recorded occupational cancer in history, caused by coal tar lodging in the folds of the skin. Tumours would grow on the scrotum of young sweeps, leading to terrible pain, disability, and early death. But perhaps the most devastating part wasn't the disease. It was that children were seen as replaceable. There were always more orphans, more abandoned children, more desperate families willing to sell their sons for a few coins. And chimney masters took full advantage. They were known to starve children to keep them small enough to fit the narrowest chimneys. Some deliberately underfed the boys until their bodies remained childlike, even into their teens. It took decades of activism, protest, and horror stories published in newspapers before society finally began to see chimney sweeping as unacceptable for children. Laws were passed in the early 1800s to ban the practice, but enforcement was weak. It wasn't until the late 19th century, almost 1900, that child sweeps fully disappeared. By then, thousands of children had lost their lives, their health, or their futures to the soot-filled tunnels of Europe's chimneys. As cities grew and technology advanced in the 1800s, one simple invention became a universal necessity: the match. A small, disposable stick of wood, coated with chemicals that could produce instant fire. They were used in kitchens, factories, homes, ships, everywhere. And inside the match factories were the workers who made them. Most of them were young women and girls. Some were teenagers, some barely 12. They were drawn to the factories by the promise of steady pay, hot meals, and the idea of a respectable job at a time when opportunities for women were extremely limited. But inside the factory walls, the reality was far from respectable. It was dangerous, dirty, and slowly, poisonously lethal. The matches of the era used white phosphorus, one of the most hazardous industrial chemicals ever employed in mass manufacturing. It was cheap, it ignited easily, and it produced a bright flame, but it also had a vicious effect on the human body. When exposed to phosphorus dust every day, teeth began to ache, then rot, then fall out. The gums would swell, the jawbone itself would start to decay from the inside, and eventually the bone became infected with a condition known as phossy jaw. This was no ordinary infection. The bone would glow faintly in the dark, literally glowing with phosphorus. The pain was described as unending. Workers couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't speak without agony. The smell was overpowering, a sickly, rotting odor that followed sufferers everywhere. And yet, for years, the match factories kept hiring. Inside the workshops, the conditions were appalling. Ventilation was poor. Dust filled the air so completely that workers carried a permanent haze on their skin and clothes. The girls often dipped matchsticks by hand into mixtures of phosphorus paste. If they scratched their nose, wiped their mouth, or even breathed too deeply, the dust entered their bodies. Some workers managed to survive years without symptoms, until one day their teeth loosened, and the slow, irreversible decay began. Doctors at first had no idea what the disease was. Some suspected poor hygiene. Others blamed the workers' lifestyles. It took decades before the pattern became undeniable. Only those exposed to white phosphorus developed the condition. And still, factory owners fought every attempt at regulation. White phosphorus was cheaper than safer alternatives, and profit mattered more than the lives of the workers who inhaled toxic dust every hour of the day. The match girls' wages were painfully low, Many lived in crowded tenements and walked miles just to reach the factory gates. They were fined for small mistakes, charged for broken equipment, even punished for being late by having their pay docked for the entire day. For them, quitting wasn't an option. If they left, they risked starvation. Yet it was these same workers who eventually pushed back. In London, 1888, a group of match girls, mostly teenagers, organized a strike. It began with just a few dozen, but soon hundreds walked out. They demanded better pay, safer working conditions, and the elimination of white phosphorus. Newspapers reported on their courage, and the public took notice. For the first time, the dangers of phossy jaw reached national attention. The strike succeeded. The company made concessions, and it became a turning point in labor rights history. But even with the triumph, white phosphorus wasn't banned immediately. Other countries continued using it. Other factories continued exposing workers to its devastating effects. It wasn't until the early 1900s, after massive international pressure, that white phosphorus was finally outlawed in match production in much of the world. But for many girls, it came too late. Thousands lived their final years disfigured, in pain, or without the ability to work again. Many died from infections or complications. Some had their jawbone surgically removed, an unimaginable procedure in a time before modern anesthesia and antibiotics. What made the tragedy even more haunting was how preventable it all was. Safer alternatives to phosphorus existed decades earlier. Factories simply chose not to use them. And so the story of the Matchstick Girls remains one of the darkest examples of industrial exploitation. The cost paid by those whose names were never recorded, who worked in silence, and whose suffering helped force industries towards safer practices. During the Industrial Revolution, coal wasn't just a resource, it was the beating heart of the age, fueling steam engines, powering factories, heating cities, and driving the massive machinery that transformed society. And deep beneath the ground, in tunnels carved into black rock, were the people who made it all possible, the coal miners. For many miners, the day began long before sunrise. Entire towns existed solely around coal pits, rows of identical worker cottages, the ever-present smell of smoke, and the distant clanking of machinery running day and night. Children grew up expecting to descend into the earth just like their fathers. The descent itself was an ordeal. Some mines had wooden hoists or crude rope lifts, but many workers climbed down ladders or walked through long, sloping shafts. The deeper they went, the darker, hotter, and stranger the world became. Lamps flickered, the air grew stale, and the temperature rose the farther the tunnels stretched away from the surface. In the mining galleries, the atmosphere was a combination of sweat, coal dust, and constant danger. The ceilings were often so low that miners spent hours crawling or stooping. Their lungs filled with fine black powder that settled into the chest and stayed there. Coal dust coated their hair, skin, and clothes until it became part of them, a permanent layer that no amount of washing could completely remove. But the most frightening threats were the ones that arrived without warning. Tunnel collapses were common. Wooden supports cracked under the weight of thousands of tons of earth. Walls shifted silently in the dark. One moment, a man would be swinging his pickaxe, and the next, the ceiling would come down in a roar of rock and dust. Rescue efforts were slow, often desperate, and not always successful. Then there were the explosions. Coal mines were filled with methane, an invisible, odorless gas that collected in pockets. All it took was a single spark, a lamp, a tool striking stone, even static. The explosion would rip through the galleries with unbelievable force, igniting coal dust hanging in the air and turning the underground world into a furnace. Entire work crews could vanish in seconds. To reduce this danger, mines introduced safety lamps, but they were far from safe. They still leaked, they still sparked, and miners were often forced to work fast, cutting corners, pushing deeper where ventilation was poor. And then there was black damp, a deadly mixture of gases that replaced oxygen. You couldn't see it, you couldn't smell it. You simply felt your limbs grow heavy, your breath shorten, and then, if you didn't escape, nothing at all. Children worked in the mines too. Boys and girls as young as 5 served as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors in absolute darkness. Others hauled heavy carts of coal, crawling on hands and knees through passages so tight that adults couldn't fit. These children developed permanent injuries in their backs and legs from years of working in cramped, unnatural positions. Families accepted these risks because mining was one of the few sources of steady income. But that income came with a terrible price. Miners often suffered from lung diseases, coal dust slowly hardening and coating their lungs over years of breathing it in. Many died young. Many spent their final years coughing violently, barely able to walk across a room. Yet despite everything, miners formed some of the strongest communities of the industrial age. They depended on one another underground, and that trust carried above ground. Shared danger bonded them. Shared hardship shaped their culture. And the sheer physical bravery of descending into the mines every day remains one of the most awe-inspiring and terrifying jobs of the era. Above ground, the Industrial Revolution brought a very different kind of danger. Cities were filled with factories, massive brick buildings with tall chimneys that never stopped smoking. Inside these factories were the machines. Enormous looms, gears, belts, spindles, flywheels, and cutting mechanisms that transformed raw materials into finished goods with staggering speed. And standing beside these machines day after day were the workers, machine tenders, operators, and assistants. Many of them were women and children. Many had no training, and almost none had protection. Because industrial safety standards didn't exist yet. Machines were built for efficiency, not for human bodies working beside them. There were no guards over the gears, no covers over the belts, no emergency stops. If something caught you, your hair, your sleeve, your hand, there was nothing to stop the machine. The noise inside a factory was deafening. Workers stood inches away from whirling metal so loud they could barely hear each other. Over time, many lost part or all of their hearing. But that was the least of the risks. Textile mills were especially notorious. The machines moved fast, thousands of threads twisting and spinning. Workers had to lean in close to tie broken threads, adjust spools, or remove lint. A single mistake could pull a finger into the gears, or an arm, or worse. And it happened constantly. Factory reports from the time show endless injuries, fingers crushed, hands torn apart, scalps ripped off when hair was caught in spinning shafts. Those who survived were often left disabled. Those who didn't were quietly replaced. The workdays were extremely long, up to 14 or 16 hours. Workers stood the entire time, often in overheated rooms, full of humidity to keep threads from breaking. The air was thick with fibers that entered their lungs, causing chronic respiratory problems similar to those of miners. Cotton dust caused mill lung, a condition that gradually tightened the chest and made breathing painful. Children faced their own horrors. They were small enough to fit under machines, places where adults couldn't reach. So whenever gears jammed or threads tangled, a child was sent underneath the running machinery to clear the blockage. Many never came out alive. Many others came out maimed for life. Accidents weren't the only danger. Exhaustion itself could kill. Workers fainted regularly. Some fell into machinery when they lost consciousness. Some simply collapsed from heat stroke or dehydration. And factory owners rarely slowed production. Machines ran nearly non-stop. Workers were expected to adapt or be replaced. But despite the brutality, these jobs shaped the modern world. They produced goods on a scale humanity had never seen. They made textiles affordable. They built the foundations of mass manufacturing. And the suffering of the workers, though largely forgotten today, led to some of the first major labor reforms. Over time, public pressure forced factories to reduce hours, hire fewer children, and eventually install safety guards on machines. But in the early decades, the price of industrial progress was paid in fingers, limbs, and lives. As factories multiplied and cities expanded, nations needed a new form of transportation, something faster than horses, cheaper than canals, and capable of crossing long distances without being limited by terrain. Railways became that solution, and building them required a workforce unlike any other. The navigators, also called navvies. Navvies were traveling laborers, tough, physically powerful men who lived in temporary camps as they moved from one project to the next. They dug foundations, cut through hills, built embankments, laid track, and blasted tunnels through solid rock. Their work reshaped entire landscapes, and the dangers were everywhere. Blasting tunnels was one of the most hazardous tasks. Workers drilled holes into rock by hand, filled them with gunpowder or dynamite, lit the fuse, and then ran as fast as they could. Sometimes the charge didn't go off. Sometimes it went off early. Sometimes rock fragments shot out with deadly force. There were countless injuries, shattered bones, lost eyesight, fatal wounds from flying debris. Even without explosives, rail construction was grueling. Navvies worked in all weather, scorching summers, freezing winters, relentless storms. They dug massive trenches using only picks, shovels, and brute strength. They lifted iron rails that weighed hundreds of pounds each. They moved earth by the ton, day after day, for years. And the conditions were not only dangerous, they were deadly. Shelters in navvy camps were crude, damp, and overcrowded. Diseases spread easily. Food was basic, often contaminated, and barely enough to sustain the extreme physical labor expected of the workers. Many navvies turned to alcohol to endure the pain and monotony. Drunken fights, theft, and injuries were common. The terrain added its own dangers. Workers carved railways across mountainsides where a single slip could send someone tumbling hundreds of feet. They bridged rivers using temporary scaffolding that swayed in the wind. They worked beside heavy carts and equipment that could crush a person instantly. And they did it all while racing against tight deadlines imposed by railway companies desperate to expand. Collapses were frequent. Tunnel roofs caved in unexpectedly. Embankments gave way. Landslides buried crews in seconds. Newspapers at the time called navvy work the most perilous civilian labor known. And yet, despite everything, hundreds of thousands of navvies took the job. Why? Because the pay, though meager by today's standards, was better than most labor available to unskilled workers of the era. It was a chance at survival, at independence, and maybe supporting a family. Their contribution is immense. Railways spread across continents because navvies carved the path, often at the cost of their lives. They built the arteries that allowed nations to trade, travel, and industrialize. But the individual stories of most navvies vanished. No records of names, no memorials, just the miles of track cutting through hills and valleys, silent reminders of the dangerous labor that made them possible. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, cities around the world began reaching upward and outward. Skyscrapers rose into the clouds. Massive steel bridges stretched across rivers and ravines that had once been barriers. And at the center of this new era of engineering were the riveters, the workers who climbed, balanced, and clung to steel skeletons hundreds of meters above the ground. There were no safety harnesses, no ropes, no nets, just boots, gloves, and the willingness to trust your balance on beams as thin as a man's arm. The job of a riveter was simple in concept, but unimaginably dangerous. White-hot rivets, small metal bolts, were heated in furnaces on the ground. A worker, called the heater, would toss the glowing rivet into the air. A catcher, standing on a narrow beam, would snatch it with a small bucket or metal can, his gloves smoking from the heat. Then the rivet was pushed into its hole and hammered in by a crew of 3 or 4 men. They worked fast because the rivet cooled quickly. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the steel frame. The entire structure vibrated. Wind whipped across the beams with enough force to make a man lose his footing if he wasn't careful. At the heights where they worked, even a small mistake was fatal. One slip on a dusty steel girder, one misstep on a beam slick with morning dew, one moment of lost concentration, and a riveter would fall, sometimes hundreds of meters, disappearing into the air without a sound. And these falls were common. Newspapers reported them in short, almost routine paragraphs. A worker fell during construction today. The fatalities were noted, and construction continued. The demand for bridges and skyscrapers was too great to slow down. But the dangers didn't end with falling. The molten rivets themselves were hazards. A single drop of hot metal could burn through clothing, blister skin, or blind an eye. Workers often came home with burns scattered across their arms and chests, small round scars that never fully healed. The constant heat, even in cold weather, made the work exhausting. The steel beams themselves posed another threat. In summer, they became scorching hot. In winter, they grew icy and brittle. Snow and wind turned the beams into hazards that shifted under a worker's feet. Storms could sweep in suddenly, leaving men scrambling to climb down before gusts of wind made descent impossible. And yet, riveters were some of the most respected workers of their age. Their bravery was legendary. Crowds would gather to watch them at work like spectators, watching a daring performance. High above, tiny silhouettes moved with absolute confidence, placing their trust in steel, wind, and themselves. The bonds between riveters were strong. They relied on each other completely. A riveter had to know that the man catching rivets wouldn't miss, that the man holding the beam steady wouldn't slip, that the team hammering the rivet together moved with rhythm and awareness. It was teamwork performed at impossible heights with no room for error. By the early 1900s, safety rules slowly improved, but for decades before that, riveters lived with danger every time they climbed a beam. Many died young. Many suffered injuries or carried lifelong scars. But the bridges and skyscrapers they built still stand today, silent monuments to the men who risked the sky to build the modern world. Long before the age of machines and chainsaws, lumberjacks were responsible for clearing the forests that fueled industry, construction, and expansion across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, logging was one of the most physically demanding and deadly jobs on the planet. Logging camps were isolated, often dozens of miles from the nearest town. Workers lived in crude wooden bunkhouses filled with the smell of wet wool, pine pitch, sweat, and smoke from the campfire. Winters were bitter and long, with temperatures dropping far below freezing. Summers were humid and filled with insects. The work never stopped, regardless of the weather. Each day began before sunrise. Lumberjacks ate heavy meals, salt pork, bread, beans, thick stews, to survive the hours of continuous labor ahead. Then they entered the forest, carrying axes and long two-man saws. With almost no mechanical assistance, they cut down massive trees that weighed thousands of pounds. The felling of a single tree was an event of its own. Lumberjacks carved notches into the trunk, judged the tree's lean, and shouted warnings as the final cut was made. Everyone nearby had to stay alert. A falling tree could change direction unpredictably. The sound of it cracking, groaning, and finally crashing into the forest floor was thunderous. But accidents were constant. Trees occasionally twisted or kicked back, striking workers unexpectedly. Branches, called widowmakers, snapped off and fell from above. A lumberjack could look up for just a moment too long and lose sight of what his own hands were doing. One misjudgment could prove fatal. And once the trees were cut, the dangers continued. Logs were dragged to rivers, where they were rolled, sorted, and floated downstream to mills. Lumberjacks worked directly on these moving log piles, using metal-tipped boots to balance on shifting wood. The logs rolled, spun, and collided as they floated. Falling between them was one of the biggest threats. Once trapped, a person could be crushed instantly or pulled underwater by the weight of the logs. Log jams were even worse. Large piles of timber got stuck at bends in the river. Lumberjacks had to climb onto the unstable mass and use long poles or explosives to break apart the jam. These jams were unpredictable. The moment they gave way, dozens of logs could roll violently, dragging anyone nearby into the chaos. Weather tested the loggers constantly. In winter, the forest floor was covered in snow and ice. Axes slipped, boots skidded, hands froze around saw handles. In summer, heat exhaustion and dehydration hit hard, and swarms of insects made concentration difficult. Despite all this, logging attracted strong, resilient men who took pride in their work. Lumberjack culture produced stories, songs, competitions, and traditions that still survive today. Their skill with axe and saw was unmatched. They moved through forests like dancers, swift, strong, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the wild. But for all its folklore and romantic imagery, early logging was one of the deadliest professions of the era. Many lumberjacks died in accidents. Many more suffered permanent injuries. Broken bones, crushed limbs, damaged lungs from sawdust-filled air. The forests they cleared built cities, railways, factories, and homes. Their labor shaped entire regions, and their courage, facing nature's raw power with only hand tools, remains one of the most striking examples of human grit. In laboratories, research centers, and reptile farms during the 1800s and early 1900s, there existed a strange and terrifying profession: snake milkers. Their job was simple but lethal: collect venom from some of the deadliest snakes on Earth. Why? Because venom was crucial for creating antivenoms, for medical research, and for studying toxins. Without snake milkers, thousands of people around the world would have died from snake bites without treatment. But every day, these workers risked their lives in ways few could imagine. Snake milkers handled multiple species daily: vipers, cobras, rattlesnakes, kraits, mambas. Each snake had its own personality, speed, and behavior. Some were shy, some were aggressive, some were unpredictable, striking without warning. A milker had to know the difference instantly, adjusting their grip and timing to each animal. The process began with capturing the snake from its enclosure. The milker used a hook or tongs to steady the snake, then grasped it firmly just behind the head. This had to be done with precision. Too tight, and the snake might thrash violently. Too loose, and it could twist around and bite. Once restrained, the milker pressed the snake's fangs against a thin membrane stretched over a glass vial. The snake instinctively bit down, releasing venom that dripped into the container. Some snakes released only a few drops, others produced enough to fill the vial. But the danger never decreased. Each snake was different every day. Some resisted. Some wrapped their bodies around the milker's arm. Some struck again the moment they were released. And because milkers often handled dozens of snakes a day, accidents were unavoidable. Snake milkers were bitten frequently, sometimes lightly, sometimes severely. A single mistake could mean slipping fingers, a sudden movement, or simply fatigue. And antivenom wasn't always available at the time. Some milkers survived repeated bites, developing partial immunity over years. Others died from a single strike. There was also the constant threat of allergic reactions. Repeated exposure to venom could cause the immune system to overreact. Some milkers developed sensitivity so extreme that even a small splash on the skin caused rashes, swelling, or anaphylaxis. Beyond the danger of bites, the work was stressful. Handling deadly snakes all day required unbroken concentration. One moment of distraction could be fatal. The environment had to be controlled. Temperature, humidity, lighting. Yet even the best conditions couldn't eliminate the risk. Outside the lab, snake milkers were often anonymous. Few people knew their names, yet their work saved countless lives. They supplied venom to research institutions. They helped develop treatments that transformed medical science. They contributed quietly, never seeking recognition. Their profession still exists today, but modern tools and safety gear have made the work far more secure. Yet in the early 1900s, the snake milker stood alone, armed only with skill, calm nerves, and the willingness to place their hands inches from fangs capable of killing. When the 20th century began, humanity unlocked a force so powerful it could light cities, cure diseases, or silently kill the very people who handled it. That force was radiation. And at first, no one truly understood the danger. Not the scientists, not the factory workers, not even the governments funding the research. So the earliest radioactive material handlers, the people working directly with radium, uranium, thorium, and all kinds of newly discovered particles, were essentially walking into the unknown. No training, no protective gear, no idea that what they were touching, inhaling, and even painting on their own bodies as a joke was slowly rewriting their cells. One of the most infamous examples were the radium girls, young factory workers, most of them teenagers, hired in the 1910s and 1920s to paint watch dials with glow-in-the-dark radium paint. At the time, glowing watches were the height of modern technology, bright, futuristic, and a symbol of progress. And the workers? They were told the paint was harmless. The company encouraged a technique called lip pointing, placing the radium-coated brush between their lips to make the tip sharp and precise. Many girls did this hundreds of times per day, swallowing microscopic bits of radium with every lick of the brush. They painted their teeth for fun. They dotted their nails so they'd glow at parties. They laughed about looking like ghost girls under the lights. But the laughter didn't last. Weeks or months later, teeth began falling out. Jawbone softened until you could poke a finger straight through the tissue. Bones became brittle and fractured with the smallest pressure. Tumors formed deep inside their bodies. This was the beginning of what would later be known as radium necrosis, one of the most horrific occupational diseases in history. And it wasn't just factory workers. Early researchers and engineers working on radioactive materials had no concept of exposure limits. Marie Curie, who made revolutionary discoveries about radioactivity, kept tubes of radium in her pockets because she liked the faint glow. Her notebooks are still radioactive to this day. Early laboratory workers developed strange burns, unexplained sickness, and anemia without understanding why. Then came the Manhattan Project, and early nuclear plants during World War II and the early Cold War. These workers handled uranium slugs with bare hands, carried plutonium solutions in glass jars, and inhaled radioactive dust constantly. Some employees tasked with monitoring contamination didn't even have Geiger counters yet. They used pieces of photographic film and hoped for the best. One wrong move meant acute radiation poisoning, vomiting, organ shutdown, and death within days. Others suffered slow, invisible damage, cancers that formed years later, blood disorders, sterility, weakened immune systems. Yet the work continued, and in many cases, these dangers were kept secret. Governments didn't want panic. Companies didn't want lawsuits. So workers continued stepping into environments that glowed, crackled, and hummed, unaware that every shift might be shortening their lives. For decades, radioactive material handlers were considered pioneers. But they were also guinea pigs, paid to walk blindfolded into a field of science no one had mapped yet. And their suffering forced the world to create safety standards, shielding protocols, and protective equipment we now consider basic. The cost of that progress? Thousands of lives. Imagine sinking to the ocean floor in a metal helmet, attached to an air hose that is your only connection to life. No electronics, no backup systems, no fancy scuba tanks. Just a canvas suit, weighted boots, and a pump on the ship above you, usually turned by a man cranking a wheel. This was the reality of deep-sea divers in the early 1900s, the men who worked on underwater cable laying, salvage missions, naval repairs, and shipwreck recoveries long before modern diving technology existed. Their suits were heavy, airtight, and utterly unforgiving. A diver could weigh over 200 pounds once fully geared up. Every step on the seafloor was slow and clumsy. Visibility was often so poor that divers said it felt like walking through ink. If the sea current picked up even slightly, it could knock them off balance and drag them along the bottom. But the most terrifying part was the lifeline, an air hose and rope tether, connecting the diver to the surface. If the hose kinked, snapped, or got tangled, the diver had minutes before suffocating. If a passing ship accidentally crossed the hose, the propeller could slice it cleanly in half. If the pump malfunctioned, the diver would feel the pressure crushing the suit inwards as oxygen supply dropped. Sometimes the helmet could even implode. Then there was the danger of rapid ascent. If a diver was yanked up too quickly, maybe the ship crew panicked or misread a signal. The sudden drop in pressure caused nitrogen to bubble inside the bloodstream. This condition, now known as the bends, was excruciating. Joints twisted, muscles seized. Some divers were left paralyzed. Others died within hours. And the ocean itself was another enemy. Divers reported encountering eels, sharks, territorial fish, and creatures they couldn't even identify. In colder waters, hypothermia set in quick. In deeper dives, the immense pressure made movement sluggish and disorienting. Despite all of this, deep-sea divers were paid surprisingly little. They were seen as expendable labor, men who could reach places no machine could yet access. Salvage divers retrieving cargo from wrecked vessels often received bonuses, but only if they survived long enough to collect them. Before modern regulators, tanks, or buoyancy controls, divers relied on instinct, experience, and trust in the surface crew. A single mistake could send a rush of seawater into the suit, freezing the body and drowning the diver instantly. These early divers pushed the boundaries of what humans could endure underwater. Their work laid the foundation for the sophisticated diving systems we rely on today. But their risks were constant, brutal, and ever-present. Proof that the ocean has always been one of the harshest workplaces on Earth. When cities like New York and Chicago began building skyscrapers in the early 20th century, a new kind of worker emerged, the men who cleaned their windows. You might imagine a platform, a harness, maybe a safety line. But in the mid-1900s, none of that existed. Early high-rise window cleaners worked with little more than a rope, a bucket, and their balance. They sat on wooden boards suspended by a single line, sometimes tied by hand, sometimes looped through improvised anchors on the rooftops. Wind gusts could turn a simple cleaning job into a fight for survival. A single slip on a wet window frame could send a worker swinging wildly hundreds of feet above the ground. Many cleaners worked without gloves because gloves reduced grip. During winters, their hands would go numb from the cold, making the task even more perilous. The equipment was often homemade. Cleaners fashioned their own seats using pieces of lumber. Some used ordinary clothesline rope. Others relied on knots they learned from sailors or Boy Scout manuals. There were no standardized safety procedures, no training programs, no regulations requiring building owners to provide proper anchors. One of the biggest dangers was overconfidence. Many early window cleaners were former iron workers or construction laborers, men used to heights. They would hop from ledge to ledge barefoot, balancing on narrow stone ridges with nothing but air beneath them. A few even performed tricks for spectators below, waving rags or posing mid-air to impress passers-by. But tragic accidents were common. A sudden gust of wind, a fraying rope, a misjudged step. Newspapers in the 1930s to 1950s frequently reported window cleaners falling hundreds of feet to their deaths, often with headlines calling them human flies. By the 1950s, skyscrapers were taller than ever. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building. Dozens of 40, 50, and 80-story towers. And yet, the cleaning methods were as primitive as they had been decades earlier. Some cleaners worked from inside the building, leaning dangerously far out of open windows. Others balanced on narrow exterior cornices that were never designed to be walked on. During the post-war economic boom, companies wanted shiny glass exteriors, but balked at paying for safe equipment or training. It wasn't until the late 1960s and 1970s, after dozens of preventable deaths, that governments began mandating safety rigs, standardized platforms, certified anchor points, harnesses, and fall arrest systems. The modern window cleaner's cradle, the kind you see today on skyscrapers, was a direct result of these early tragedies. High-rise window cleaners of the mid-1900s were daredevils by necessity. Their job wasn't just cleaning. It was a balancing act between life and death, 200 meters above the street. In today's world, we like to believe that deadly epidemics belong to the past. Stories from textbooks, things that happened before modern medicine, before international health agencies, before we knew how viruses worked. But the truth is that some of the most terrifying disease outbreaks have happened in just the last few decades. And when they strike, it's not just doctors and nurses on the front lines. There is an entire group of workers whose job is so horrifying, so emotionally crushing, and so dangerous that most people don't even realize they exist. They are the Ebola burial teams. During outbreaks in West Africa, particularly the devastating crisis of 2014 to 2016, Ebola spread rapidly through bodily fluids. The virus could remain active on a dead body for days. That meant funerals, which normally involved washing, touching, even hugging the deceased, became one of the most deadly sources of transmission. So governments and humanitarian organizations formed special burial units. Their job was simple in theory, but nightmarish in reality. Locate the dead, retrieve the body, disinfect the area, and bury the victim safely, without becoming infected themselves. Every burial was performed in full protective gear, sealed suits, double gloves, rubber boots, goggles, sometimes taped seams to prevent even a pin-sized gap. That gear kept workers alive, but it also became a torture chamber in the blazing tropical heat. Inside a suit, temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers soaked in sweat, lungs straining, vision fogging behind their goggles. Many could only stay in the gear for 45 to 60 minutes before risking heat exhaustion or collapse, and the work was constant. During the peak of the outbreak, bodies were found in homes, clinics, market stalls, sometimes lying for hours because families were terrified to call for help. Burial teams arrived not only to collect the dead, but to face grieving relatives who didn't always understand the danger. Some communities believed the teams were government agents, or foreigners bringing disease rather than preventing it. Rocks were thrown at them. Vehicles were blocked. In extreme cases, burial workers were attacked. The stigma was overwhelming. Many team members hid their jobs from their own neighbors. Children were told not to hug them. Some were kicked out of apartments or refused service at shops. The people who risked everything to stop the virus were treated like walking contagions. And yet they continued. Every morning started the same: a safety briefing, hydration, gear inspection. Then the radio would crackle with calls. Suspected case in a village, body found near a road, another death in a treatment center. Teams suited up, stepped into disinfectant pools, and went to work. Entering a home meant tiptoeing through grief and contamination. Furniture soaked in bodily fluids, mattresses stained, family members crying, desperate for answers or comfort. The burial team's job was both clinical and compassionate. Disinfect, secure the body in special bags, sanitize the home, and explain calmly why no one could touch their loved one again. Then came the burial itself. Graves dug deep, often in designated safe zones. Workers carefully lowered body bags, never letting the outer surface touch unprotected hands. Every motion was deliberate. Every mistake could mean death. Afterward, the most nerve-wracking moment came. Taking off the suit. Removing PPE was more dangerous than wearing it. Sweat dripped, hands shook. If a contaminated glove brushed bare skin, that could be the end. Teammates watched each other closely, guiding every step. Left glove off, right glove off, step back, peel the hood, disinfect again. These workers rarely received recognition. No medals, no headlines, no parades. Many were volunteers. Some were ordinary villagers who learned how to put on a suit one day and dug graves the next. But without them, the outbreak would have been far deadlier. The virus would have spread unchecked through traditional funerals, claiming entire families and wiping out communities. Ebola burial teams are proof that sometimes the bravest jobs in the world happen far from cameras, done by people sweating in plastic suits, fighting terror, exhaustion, and stigma just to give the dead a safe farewell. If you want to find one of the last truly dangerous workplaces left in the modern world, look offshore, miles from land, surrounded by waves, wind, and steel. That's where you'll find oil rig roughnecks, the men and women who drill into the earth beneath the ocean to pull up the oil that powers much of our society. Oil rigs look like floating cities, but they're more like giant metal beasts, loud, vibrating, constantly in motion, and full of machinery that does not forgive mistakes. Roughnecks work long shifts, often 12 to 14 hours, in conditions that swing from scorching heat to freezing storms. And the hazards? There are dozens, but 3 stand out. First, explosions. Oil and gas rigs pump flammable material under incredible pressure. A single spark, a malfunctioning valve, or a pocket of gas escaping at the wrong moment can turn the entire platform into a fireball. Blowouts, when pressurized oil or gas erupts uncontrollably, are rare today thanks to modern safety systems. But when they happen, the results are catastrophic. The Deepwater Horizon disaster of 2010 killed 11 workers and triggered the largest marine oil spill in history. Even smaller incidents leave permanent scars on survivors. Second, slip hazards. Life on a rig is slick. Oil spills, grease drips, rain, seawater, and drilling mud coat the floors. Roughnecks climb stairs, carry equipment, and operate heavy tools, all while standing on surfaces that can suddenly become an ice rink of sludge. A fall from a platform a few meters high can cause broken bones. A fall over the railing into the ocean. In bad weather, recovery teams might not reach you in time. Third, extreme storms. The ocean is unpredictable. Waves can rise several stories high, slamming into the rig and shaking everything inside. Workers describe trying to sleep in bunks that swing like hammocks or trying to tighten bolts while the entire floor shifts beneath them. During hurricanes, rigs sometimes must be evacuated, and that journey by helicopter or boat is dangerous on its own. But roughnecks face more than physical threats. There's the crushing isolation. Rigs are far from society, often reachable only by chopper. Workers spend weeks away from family. Their schedule becomes a cycle of work, sleep, eat, repeat. Many report feeling like they live in a different world, one ruled by alarms, machinery, and the endless roar of drilling. The job demands teamwork and trust. You work beside people holding wrenches the size of baseball bats, operating cranes that swing thousands of pounds of steel overhead. Any worker who loses focus can injure everyone around them. Fatigue is constant. Mistakes are unforgiving. And yet, despite all the risks, roughnecks take pride in their work. They're known for being tough, skilled, and resourceful. They keep the world's energy supply flowing, one dangerous shift at a time. Most people don't think about what happens after the police leave. The detectives pack up. The coroner takes the body. The flashing lights fade. But what remains is often a room filled with blood, tissue, odors, and personal belongings frozen in tragedy. And someone has to clean it. Crime scene cleaners, sometimes called biohazard remediation specialists, handle the aftermath of suicides, accidents, homicides, unattended deaths, and traumatic incidents. It is one of the most emotionally crushing and psychologically intense jobs in the modern world. The danger starts with biohazards. Blood carries pathogens, HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and countless bacteria. Cleaning isn't just wiping up. It involves chemical disinfectants, enzyme solutions, industrial-grade respirators, and full protective suits. Workers scrape dried blood from walls, remove soaked carpet, tear out contaminated flooring, and sometimes cut through furniture using saws and knives. Every step must be precise. One slip with a razor blade, one needle hidden in bedding, one droplet that splashes the wrong way. The consequences can be lifelong. Then there's the environment. Many scenes are in cramped apartments with no ventilation. Some are in homes cluttered with debris. Some involve decomposition. When a person passes away and isn't discovered for days or weeks, the body breaks down. Fluids seep into floors. The smell, thick, sour, overwhelming, clings to clothing and hair, no matter how much protective gear is worn. Workers often describe it as something that never fully leaves their memory. But the physical danger isn't the hardest part. The emotional toll is. Crime scene cleaners walk into rooms still heavy with grief. Family members often linger nearby, devastated, apologizing for the mess, unsure where to stand. Some want to talk, to process what happened. Others cry silently. Cleaners must balance compassion with professionalism, offering comfort while doing work that is deeply invasive, removing mattresses, lifting belongings, erasing the physical evidence of someone's final moments. Many cleaners say that what haunts them isn't the blood, it's the silence. Hours spent alone in a room where something tragic happened, sorting objects someone used every day, photographs, notes on the fridge, unfinished meals, a calendar still open to the previous month. They see glimpses of lives interrupted suddenly. Some scenes are violent, some are heartbreaking, some involve children. Some are so personal that workers go home unable to speak for hours. The job requires emotional armor, but also empathy. Too much detachment and you become cold. Too much compassion and you burn out. Many workers struggle with nightmares, anxiety, or a sense of carrying the weight of strangers' tragedies. And yet, crime scene cleaners provide an essential service. They don't just remove biohazards, they help families begin to heal. They restore living spaces so relatives don't have to see the worst moments of their loved ones' lives. They step into darkness so others don't have to. It is modern work in the most literal sense, shaped by today's world, today's cities, today's tragedies. But it is also one of the most psychologically demanding, quietly heroic jobs in existence. Throughout history, work has never just been about earning a living. For many, it has meant staring directly into danger, darkness, and death, because someone had to. And when we look back across the centuries, we find that the most terrifying jobs weren't always the ones done by soldiers or warriors. Often, they were performed by ordinary people whose names were never recorded, whose stories were rarely told, and whose risks we hardly imagine today. We began in the ancient world, where workers carved, built, and labored in environments meant to honor gods and kings, but not protect human life. In the deep desert of Egypt, tomb builders lived in isolated villages, shaping sacred chambers inside cliffs and pyramids, where a single misjudged cut could bring hundreds of tons of stone down on them. And below the streets of Rome, catacomb diggers listened to the ceiling crack and crumble as they carved out miles of burial tunnels by lamplight, never sure which breath would be their last. Even the Roman gladiator trainer, a lanista, lived in constant danger, surrounded by weapons, violent brawls, and desperate men who might decide that escape was worth killing for. Then we entered the medieval world, a time when survival itself felt fragile. Gong farmers worked waist-deep in sewage, navigating toxic gas and collapsing tunnels in the pitch-black night. Plague doctors walked through streets lined with bodies, treating the sick while knowing every visit could infect them. Stonemasons, perched on scaffolds hundreds of feet high, risked death daily to build the great cathedrals whose beauty we admire today, but rarely think about the lives it cost. In the age of public execution, danger took on a more psychological shape. Executioners lived on the edge of society, handling death with precision and ritual, carrying a burden heavier than their axes. Body snatchers prowled graveyards in the dark, chased by mobs and guards, while supplying the cadavers that fueled medical science. And witch hunters, driven by paranoia and superstition, wielded enormous power, often becoming targets themselves when the tides of fear turned. The age of discovery pushed danger out to sea. Sailors on early voyages endured starvation, scurvy, shipwrecks, brutal discipline, and the constant threat of storms that could swallow entire fleets. Whalers chased massive animals across freezing oceans, facing exploding carcasses, snapped harpoons, and fires that often burned ships to the waterline. In the early modern era, danger found its way into chimneys and match factories. Child chimney sweeps crawled through narrow shafts, choking on soot, risking suffocation, and later developing fatal diseases. Matchstick girls handled white phosphorus every day, a chemical that slowly ate away their bones, disfiguring their faces and causing a condition so horrifying the world eventually banned the substance entirely. The Industrial Revolution amplified everything. Coal miners dug into unstable earth, surrounded by gas that could ignite without warning. Factory machine tenders worked beside exposed gears that crushed fingers, arms, and clothing in an instant. Railway navigators blasted tunnels through mountains with unstable explosives, facing falling rocks and brutal weather as they carved the world's new transportation arteries. The late 1800s and early 1900s brought new dangers with modern technology. Bridge riveters dangled hundreds of meters above rivers and cities, hammered by wind while catching red-hot rivets. Lumberjacks balanced on rolling logs and chopped trees that could fall in unpredictable directions. Snake milkers collected venom from multiple species every day, accepting that being bitten dozens or even hundreds of times over a career was simply part of the job. The 20th century added invisible threats. Radioactive material handlers, including the radium girls and early nuclear workers, were exposed to radiation long before its effects were understood. Deep-sea divers, wearing suits heavier than their own bodies, depended on fragile lifelines and pumps to keep them alive. And high-rise window cleaners clung to skyscrapers with nothing but ropes they tied themselves, cleaning glass hundreds of feet above the ground. Finally, even in modern times, some jobs remain terrifying. Ebola burial teams risked infection, exhaustion, and social rejection, while safely laying victims to rest. Oil rig roughnecks braved explosions, storms, isolation, and machines powerful enough to tear a person apart. And crime scene cleaners entered rooms heavy with trauma, facing biohazards and emotional weight long after the siren stopped. Across every era, one theme remained constant. The world only functions because someone is willing to do the jobs most people could never stomach. The people in these stories weren't thrill seekers or adrenaline junkies. They were fathers and mothers, apprentices, farmers' sons, children from poor families, skilled craftsmen, and ordinary laborers. They worked in silence, in shadows, in places the rest of society preferred not to see. And yet, because of them, cities grew, empires expanded, medicine advanced, infrastructure rose, technology progressed, and daily life, from clean streets to clear windows to safe burials, became possible. Their courage wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't rewarded, but it shaped the world. Tonight, we've walked through thousands of years of terrifying work, from stone dust in the lungs of cathedral builders to radiation glowing on the watches painted by factory girls. From the darkness of medieval sewers to the crushing silence inside a crime scene. These stories remind us that behind every structure, every discovery, every modern convenience, there are workers who risked, and sometimes lost, their lives. Their names may be forgotten. Their struggles rarely appear in textbooks, but their sacrifices are woven into everything around us. And now, we remember them.